Dan Adams is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at Northeastern. He founded Landing Studio, a design and planning practice that develops tactics for positively integrating active global industries into their local contexts in 2005. Since then, Landing Studio has worked on projects with port facilities and communities in Boston and New York through the design of headquarters buildings, port infrastructure, demolition plans, shared industrial public park landscapes, light installations, festivals, museum exhibitions, and industrial community operations agreements. Research includes the study of port facilities, ocean transport, mining operations, and the industrial ecologies around the world. Dan has a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Michigan and a master's degree from Harvard University, where he received the AIA Medal and Kelly Thesis Prize, as well as the Drucker Research Fellowship for ongoing research studying global production and transport of salt and the unique integration of this industry with communities and ecology. Please join me in welcoming Dan Adams.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, George, for inviting me to talk to the class today. So I'm going to just give a brief introduction and then talk through about 3 projects that are currently ongoing in my work. So what this first slide is essentially trying to illustrate is the sort of conception, a new conception of urban infrastructure as a balance between competing interests in the urban environment. So where an urban infrastructure is often built to satisfy a singular or specific purpose, how do we start to understand that large-scale urban infrastructure and industrial infrastructure can actually be tuned to the various interests in a city? So just to sort of give some background precedent to this, I think looking at the island of Manhattan as essentially a singular piece of infrastructure is helpful. Here you see on the top an aerial photograph from only about 60 years ago, where you see the iron grid of Manhattan extending into the shoreline, into a series of industrial piers, which were, of course, the receiver and distributors of goods into what is, in fact, the largest consumer in the United States. Essentially housing so many people, consumes so many goods. And you can see in the 50s how that system at the waterfront was a major gateway for goods into and out of the city. The barges connected into freight rail. The freight rail brought goods that were produced in the city out and goods into the city. And now what you see on the what would be your right is that every single one of these pieces of infrastructure has essentially lost that purpose. So that the current status of Manhattan is, of course, that there are no goods delivered or distributed by barge, and there are no goods delivered or distributed by freight rail. And so Manhattan, again, the largest consumer in the United States, has become completely dependent on the singular method of transit of trucking, typically from Port Newark, which is the least efficient transit method, accordingly amplifying the environmental footprint of that infrastructure significantly. So that while those pieces of infrastructure have in large case been repurposed for more contemporary uses, let's say shoreline defenses or even as public parks, they've been stripped of that industrial capacity. So in the question of kind of what is more or less green, let's say, the transition to parks, while maybe being more amenable to the local community, in fact strips away that infrastructural capacity. Much of my investigation is to analyze ways to actually balance these, as opposed to them needing to be an either or. Are there the potential for them to be a both and? These slides I put up just to show 2 kind of consequences. The federal and the regional governments recognize the dependency that we all have for large-scale industrial infrastructure based on our sort of communal needs for goods. Accordingly, they create a great deal of legislation around the idea of broad regional sustainability, such as the preservation of rail, such as the preservation of ports and harbors. On the other hand, small-scale local communities, in fact, see very little benefit often in those infrastructures. And they accordingly seek out to transform their waterfronts, to transform their rail corridors into more community beneficial programs, such as rails to trails or the conversion to parks on the waterfront. And the conflict between these regional initiatives and these local initiatives, in fact, leads to what I call a great urban stagnation, which is happening across the east coast of the United States and, in fact, the west coast of the United States on the waterfront, where here you're seeing some of the most valuable real estate in Boston on the bottom and New York on the top, essentially being used for auto scrapping or temporary uses like car parking. The most dominant use of the industrial waterfront of Boston right now is parking, which has no advantage to anyone because they can't actually work out a balanced use for these landscapes. Accordingly, our work tries to find ways of better designing these infrastructures so that they can serve both interests. So some of what I'll talk about today is my role. I'm an architect, but I think the sort of palette of what we work on far exceeds what is typically understood as sort of an architect's role to make building. I think it's also really changed, in my mind at least, the way an architect in fact works, where an architect perhaps typically works on very specific and finite projects and products. Our way of working is much more in the life of the infrastructure. One thing we've sort of come to understand, and I hope this is clear in our projects, is that designing for sustainability is not a finite process, and your role as a designer is not finite. You know, you don't just implement something and leave it behind. Infrastructure in particular, and industries and cities exist over a duration of time. They exist over a lifetime, and the context changes, the industry changes, the infrastructure changes. And so what was efficient or sustainable one day is very different in a matter of very quick time. So how do you design for the life of an industry, and what is the role of a designer to essentially function across that life? So to quickly go through a few projects, this is actually our most recent project, which we've just started. Very excited about it. We're literally just starting it about last week. This is for a stretch of I-93, which is the most, it's the sort of, I'd say, most traveled north-south arterial coming into and out of Boston. So this is just south of downtown Boston. This was, in fact, during the Big Dig, sort of the tail end of the development where there was a huge amount of investment putting the central artery underground. Just before it goes underground, they actually created a huge elevated infrastructure that leads from Quincy into Boston. And what was fascinating to us about this is even though the whole sort of premise of the central artery was to reconnect the community to the waterfront by depressing the central artery, just south of the city, this major infrastructure that they expanded, in fact, did quite the opposite. It reinforced an existing boundary in the city, which you see now looking from the south end to South Boston. Here's this mega piece of infrastructure built only a few years ago, in fact. And what was compelling to us is that from the street view, from the community's perspective, of course, this landscape is fairly detrimental, sort of quite literally a barrier in the city, versus as you actually go under that infrastructure, the sort of character of the space changes dramatically, and it actually becomes this very dynamic landscape. And so the charge we've been asked, we're working with the Mass DOT, the sort of agency that manages this infrastructure, to redesign the space under the highway. Right? So what we're first looking at is this observation that while this is a major connector in the city for people, thousands of people, to get into and out of the city, and in fact through the city, it on the same hand subdivides communities quite sharply. So this being the Bostonography maps, you guys may have seen these, fairly sort of well documented at this point, where essentially they're tracing people's cognitive perception of the cities in which they live. And you can see here, I think what's interesting about it is on one hand, through a series of interviews, they've identified how people understand communities like South Boston versus the South End. But in many ways, what's more interesting in these maps is to observe what, in fact, hasn't been understood, right, is these spaces between the community. And more often than not, what you start to discover is those are the major infrastructures in the city. These maps sort of show that no one seems to, even though these are probably some of the biggest landmarks, things everyone uses, visitors to the city, people who live in the city, no one has a stake in them. No one feels they own them. They're not really part of the city. They're sort of at the edges of everything. And so the first sort of philosophy of how we approach a project like this is to actually look at the project and determine, well, if we sort of strip away that perception, how is it centered in the city? And when you look at the even just overall geomorphology of Boston, you quickly discover that it's quite in the heart of the sort of entire Boston district. And in fact, it serves as a gateway between many of the most sort of admired and loved resources in the city, which are the green corridors. Something I want to show in the precedent, we look at a lot of different projects of other designers. George actually brought Aquino from Sasaki to show. He showed this project, I think, last year, which is the Buffalo Bayou project, where here you actually see a river system intersecting a highway. And we were very excited by this project. By it, you can see here the relation of the four-point channel to the highway and how those different infrastructures can actually integrate. Are there ways to actually create new types of landscapes under the highway that extend the public space of the city? Similarly, this is a project by a small design firm called D-Land Studio, where they're looking at the potential of how the landscape can actually treat the water coming off of the highway before it goes into our shared water systems. How can you actually sort of decontaminate the water? These types of projects, this actually now is starting to be a project in Toronto for how to sort of transition that into a public space, is what's led to the foundation of our design with the Mass DOT, which is essentially a new layered strategy for how to build a public landscape in the sort of understory of the highway. And you can see what we're looking at, and I'll go through some examples of this in some of our other work, is types of interventions that we're now proposing in a layered strategy. Again, the concept that to remedy or interact with a landscape as dynamic as this, it's not a matter of building a building or building a piece of infrastructure. Almost all of our designs work in a layered strategy across multiple mediums, which again causes us as designers to essentially shape shift or morph or change the medium in which we work. Obviously working with a lot of sub-consultants, different specialists, but ourselves having to become specialists in diverse things. The next project, so that project is very much in its infant state. This project is far more developed. This is a project I started in 2005 when I was a student myself. This was analyzing the convergence of major global shipping networks into Boston Harbor. And what's fascinating, I think, in this photo is to see that intersection of scales, right? That large-scale global infrastructure, which is tuned to distribution around the world, brings to a local community like Chelsea, Massachusetts. So here you see a mega piece of infrastructure, in fact, the largest piece of infrastructure in Boston, which is the Federal Navigation Channel. Here you see how that navigation channel reverberates on land as essentially an industrial corridor, right? An industrial wall designed to receive this global shipping network. And I think as this photograph shows very well, those two systems in fact converge in communities like Chelsea, Massachusetts. So this is road salt being delivered from Mexico to the shores of Chelsea, Massachusetts. And you can see that kind of contradiction of scales, right? How very quickly you understand that people can perceive this as a blight or an intrusion into their city, even though it's a resource we all depend on, and even though this is a highly efficient regional system of delivery that's saving tons of trucks on the road, it in fact has very immediate impacts on the people who live in the city. This is that distribution network, just to give a sense of that sort of scale of global infrastructure. So some of what we looked at as, I'd say, designers at first was just the specific characteristics of this landscape. Again, I think one of the problems that often comes up with people, how people address these industrial infrastructures is sort of a all industries are the same mentality, like oil terminals, salt terminals, rail yards. They're industry, and we classify them as such and sort of put them on the edge to not be thought about. I think one of the really fascinating things is that these industries are actually very specific and very unique. So in the case of the salt industry, it's one of the few remaining large-scale material distributions that's actually very visible and very exposed. It's not shipped in containers. It's not put in tanks. It's actually something that the community can watch and understand. So in this case, they can understand where all the materials come from. In this case, they can actually see how the seasons affect the industry. Clearly, road salt is more used in the winter, so you see those landscapes swell and then decrease in the summer. This is the view looking down from Chelsea. The modern ships are able to discharge their cargo in about 12 hours. So you might literally go to work one morning and your view to Boston might look like this. But if a shipment of salt from Mexico comes in, right, which has been evaporated from the ocean recently, you see that sort of view erased. Then you might go to work the next day and come home and a shipment from Northern Ireland, where it's been mined from deep underground, has been added, right? So what you start to understand is that this is a very kinetic landscape. Again, this is not something that a simple piece of architecture could encase or hide away. So we start looking again for inspiration at different artists' work. This is Jenny Holzer. She's an artist most renowned, I'd say, for her projections. This was one piece I probably most admire, which is essentially a simple set of poems projected out over the ocean, such that as waves rise out of the ocean, you can actually read the poem, versus when the ocean goes flat, the poem disappears. So it integrates that landscape system with the depiction of a story and laminates those two things. In fact, changing the definition of the wave and changing the definition of the poem. So for us, we were very intrigued by the ability of a design to morph and react to such a kinetic landscape. And obviously light, we had no money to do these projects at the time as students. So light as a very bang for your buck material that could morph with a changing landscape. We actually proposed at this time a series of similar poems, like Jenny Holtz, are very poetic, very beautiful. And it just so happened that at that time, the Red Sox actually were good, and they, as they are again today, and the dock operators said, we don't want poems, we just want to say go Sox. And so we changed the whole philosophy of the design to go from something that was maybe very abstract, very poetic, to something that was very everyday, right? And something very sort of tuned to the everyday systems of the landscape. So we essentially started over the course of a year projecting a series of sort of changing messages with the city that actually sought to change this very large landscape, this very foreign landscape, into something very local, just a very small sort of scale, in a way simple message board. So timed with, when it was time to vote, when it was high school graduation, Christmas carols. And what we quite liked, again, is that the light, in many ways, didn't try and hide or conceal the operations of the industry, but actually magnify them to make them more of a kinetic character in the city. You can see how it changes the kind of horizon of the entire city, right? This was one installation I quite liked where we did this at the end of the season, and of course it just disappears and you see the salt distributed at the street. I think what was compelling to us and what really in a way launched a lot of this work was to see how in such a simple, efficient gesture, it actually changed the entire conversation about the industry from being something that was like this foreign blight to all of a sudden they're writing about the local salt piles in the art section of the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. And the company that we were working with, I think, was also equally compelled to start understanding that there was different ways that this facility could be perceived or appreciated. So that led into what I think was a slight advancement on that concept, which is essentially a film festival that we've started designing. We've done it twice. We're going to do it again this upcoming summer, called LUMEN. And this is based on, again, analyzing the capacity of the industry and the specific operations of the industry. In this case, seeing the fact that salt is very seasonal, as I mentioned before, right? In winter months, we use a lot of road salt. Massachusetts uses about 1.5 million tons of salt annually to de-ice its roadways. So those pictures I've seen, these facilities typically hold about 200,000 tons. But 1.5 million tons is quite a bit. It'd be hard to probably fathom that. But if you can imagine this summer, what that creates as an opportunity is when you actually remove that salt, you're left with a massive area of land in the cities, sort of a quantity of land right on the waterfront that typically isn't available in most urban environments. So part of our work with the company, again, living as sort of a living designer, working with them year after year, not as a finite project, but designing the life of the industry, is to actually transform that landscape for new uses, to repurpose that landscape. So we've essentially started a series of festivals. We actually have an event at our dock just tonight. I think the most sort of successful of those events I'm maybe most excited by is what's called LUMEN. It's a film festival with the Council of Arts and Humanities in Staten Island, where we essentially engage about 40 artists from the international community, New York and the world, to install pieces on the dock. Our work is to essentially transform that dock on a temporary basis into essentially a stage set for these events. Usually they're one-night events. We have about 7,000 people typically come to the events with the 40 artists installing for just the one night. And we transform what is in fact a former U.S. gypsum facility that we're demolishing to make way for a salt dock into this venue for the arts. We install essentially a series of lights which work to amplify that industrial landscape, both for honestly pragmatic reasons, safety reasons, to make these industrial environments usable, but then to set the stage for the intervention of the artist. And then we work with the artist to essentially manipulate the various components of the industry to become the frameworks for their installations. I think what's quite exciting about this is recognizing that these facilities have their own unique and specific capacities, right? So our ability, for example, to partner with other industries and get materials very rapidly, very easily, is inherent to how these businesses work. So we're able to translate and tune those systems to make highly responsive, robust art venues that can actually support types of installations that no museum could possibly support. I thought one of the most interesting aspects of this is the salt medium itself. Obviously, you're dealing with people who are very good at shaping landscapes with salt. So we work with actually the crews of the dock to assemble a series of landscapes, again, specifically tuned to each of the artists' work, to create a series of sort of gallery spaces, podiums for installations, projection surfaces, and installations specific to the artist's work. And again, the outcome of this has been very compelling to us because now, in addition to this facility being understood as a major global resource, it's actually been identified, this is in Staten Island, New York, as an art venue for the city, right? So it's actually now listed in the register of art venues in Staten Island as a resource for the city. And we actually just in about 1 week, we're getting this project, which is the Ship of Tolerance by Ilya and Amelia Kabakov, two very significant Russian artists, as this has now become sort of a public art venue on top of its function as a salt dock, simply by opening it to that use. So the last project I want to show is probably the most flushed out of these sort of ongoing interventions. This is a project we've been working on for about 6 years. This is back in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where we had done those initial light projections. And this is actually a project to expand the salt terminal. So following my initial work with the company was those projections, and following, I'd say, some of the success of that work, we were engaged to essentially reconceive the potentials of this oil terminal. That's a Coastal Oil, which is a division of Texaco, had pulled out of Boston Harbor and left behind this about 6-acre oil terminal immediately adjacent to the salt facility. The salt facility is actually in need of expansion due to the sort of operations of new technologies of ships. And so what we started hashing out, first with the company, eventually incorporating many dialogues with the city. This was about a 6-year negotiation between state, city, and industrial representatives, is essentially a repartitioning and a reuse of that former oil terminal into a shared facility of salt distribution and salt operations and a new public park, which is called the Port, which stands for the Publicly Organized Recreation Territory. And again, I think right off the bat, one of the most interesting things about the sort of a negotiation was recognizing the specificity of the industry, where it, again, expands in the winter, contracts in the summer. I think quite fortuitously, parks work in quite the opposite, right? In the winter in New England, parks are fairly underused, where in the summer they're very used. So it's kind of a marriage made in heaven, parks and salt docks. It's a little random maybe. But what was fortuitous for us was then to partner these together and actually create a shared landscape here in the middle, where in the summer months that will be used as an expansion of the park area for basketball courts, a bike track, and additional parking for what is then a year-round park area versus the year-round salt area, which then in the winter expands over that hardscape to become an expansion of the park. Again, I think just as a precedent, and this was actually quite funny because the High Line for us is a sort of an amazing design, right? Everyone appreciates it's completely transformed this district of the city, yet putting that in the equation of the loss of all the regional infrastructure in Manhattan, it also takes on a different. So for us, while we appreciate the design, it has different ramifications on the urban environment. Ironically, this was the project we took our clients to in order to sell them on the idea of the merging, to show them that essentially the city could appreciate industrial infrastructure in this way. And it really wasn't until we were able to show the clients this specific project that I think they could even sort of appreciate the potentials of merging industry and public access landscapes. So this was sort of a comic that came out, I think a very cynical comic right at the beginning of our proposal. And I think this quote kind of sums up where the city was at in their mind, right? I have a feeling I will find out soon what Chelsea will stand for the next 100 years. Will it be residential or industrial? I hope you choose wisely. I already have one bag packed. And it was to say, that a city can only be one or the other. There's no way that you could have both a residential community and an industry cohabitating. Keep in mind, the industry has been here for 50 years. Everyone who works there works in the city, right? So in many ways, it's very interwoven, yet it's still perceived as something very sort of separate. How do we as designers sort of reposition that? So this was just a sort of a breakdown of a few of the meetings, right? This is a 6-year negotiation process, right? The outcome of that, though, I think was very powerful in its ability to start balancing and reconciling these different interests, where again, you see this being a slightly more fleshed out zoning strategy where it's a zone, but it's also a phasing strategy for construction, where the first phase was the construction of the salt. Second phase is the construction of the park, which is actually opening for its first public event tonight. And then the construction of Zone 1, which is the next stage, the development of a new headquarters distribution hub for the company. So to just run you through that process quickly, and then I'll be done, this is the initial phases, which was essentially the removal of the petroleum from the site, the kind of remediation of the site. This was an asphalt batching plant. Probably should have said that before. Asphalt batching in urban environments is a very difficult industry, probably not one I would advocate, in the sense that you have to actually boil a very low-grade, heavy oil in order to get it fluid enough to pave our roads. Accordingly, you're actually putting a huge amount of oil vapor into the atmosphere right in an urban environment, which is fairly damaging. So I'd say one of our initial goals of this project was quite simply to just eliminate an asphalt batching plant from the city and replace it with a more urban industry. These are just some demolition photos of the deconstruction of the oil terminal. Again, I think even recognizing that this is a living process in the city, we engaged the process of demolition through design with a series of light installations that essentially sort of marked the removal of the oil terminal. When you talk to many people in the city of Chelsea, they'll say, oh, I have no idea even growing up here that we were on the waterfront. We have no connection. So part of the sort of impetus for even these installations is to find ways of sort of re-engaging the waterfront with the city. So phase 1 was the construction of the salt facility. And as you see here, even the organization of the salt piles was built around a series of community views, shaping the views of the community to the waterfront. How do you choreograph and sculpt the salt itself? This process of construction, we tried to tap the networks that exist within the industry. So here you're actually seeing Logan Airport. They had to remill all of their runways at the time we were building our dock, so we were able to build the dock out of the former runways of Logan Airport and recycle a material that was sort of destined for landfill to become the base for our dock construction. And then this portion, which is the development of the public park, again, repurposes a series of the industrial elements of the park. We essentially categorized all the different elements of the oil terminal, analyzed their various purposes and use, and designed the translation of those uses to become new elements in the public park. So this is the recycling diagram, sort of showing how one thing becomes something else, how a truck loading rack becomes a viewing platform, how a system of domes get removed and become trellises over the park, how we cut the tanks themselves down to become containers for various programs. I'll show in a minute, like an amphitheater. And then this becomes essentially the sort of design philosophy, right? About extending the space of the industrial landscape and repurposing those elements to become new elements in a public park, where the various platforms become viewing elements, that sort of the tank that's been cut down for an amphitheater, and then trellises for lighting and scaffolds. And these are just a few photos from the last couple of weeks as we're now sort of preparing the final stages of construction. This is the view from that amphitheater. Part of the landscape design is, of course, that because this is a historically contaminated site, we had to create a new landscape cap. And I think one of the things that was particularly interesting here is just to understand that by repurposing those elements from the industrial landscape, you actually start sort of continuing that horizon, right? Continuing those elements that are often perceived as discrete to industry and extending them into the public realm, blurring that boundary through the design of the architecture itself. So just to close, this was the quote I read just a moment ago, And now this was a quote that was just recently published, which I think shows the sort of change in mentality which we're, I'd say, striving for in the design. Now, however, that's changing. For the first time, Chelsea is breaking through the heavy industry piled up along the Chelsea Creek and reconnecting with its waterfront. This is the same sort of reclamation project that's underway with more fanfare across the harbor in Boston. There's one major difference between the two. Boston has seen a boom in real estate, that industry left behind, while Chelsea is bringing its citizens to the waterfront by growing industry, which for us, I think, really embodies that goal, right? How do we not see these kind of infrastructures of our environment as something separate from us, but redesign them so they become part of the urban fabric? Thank you.
More than our other speakers, you already know that I think this is spectacularly great stuff. And I think for the purposes of this course, as I mentioned when we were walking over, it's particularly relevant because this is about understanding the problem that a designer is being asked to solve in a completely new way. And I wonder if, I mean, there's so many things to talk about here, but since we're finishing on the reinvention of the Salt Pier as a public park and art performance space, I have to ask, it's such a, I think we can all imagine, even if we don't do it ourselves, that working in the public sphere like this with so many different constituents is extremely difficult and complicated. How did you get this ball rolling? How did you start that process? I know it's almost 10 years ago, but I mean, did somebody see a studio project that you did when you were in school? How did this go from being an interesting observation about the scale of industry and salt production globally and how it redounds to the local?
No, well, it's, I quite like that story, actually. Very, like, the literal story. I was a student doing my graduate work in architecture, and a professor had said we had to do a series of mapping exercises in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And this was Margaret Crawford, who I know you know. And she sent us into the city to just be detectives to essentially unearth aspects of the city. And we happened, that photograph I showed of the salt kind of coming up to the house was actually from 2005 when I first had visited the site. And quite literally, we saw this amazing salt pile. We didn't know anything about it. My wife and I walked into that facility and started talking to a terminal manager who happened to be there and happened to be a very energetic guy, right? But he was really pissed off. He was really pissed off because he felt like they were actually doing a lot of things to engage the city. They were having events. They were trying to sort of reach out to the city. And essentially, they were having not a lot of luck creating any kind of positive relationships. And he just literally started to, he had his son who works at the dock take me, myself and my partner for about an hour-long tour of the ships, explaining everything. Then after that, he sat us down in his office, and he said, so what can you do? And he quite literally said, and what was quite apparent when he explained the situation, that it was really quite a matter of design, and that it was just that they weren't really designing anything. They weren't designing that relationship. They were doing sort of, I would say, pretty maybe very positive things to reach out, but they weren't actually manipulating the landscape. They weren't thinking about how to tune their operations to fit with the city. And so we essentially started coming up with a series of proposals, the first of which was the projections, which helped change that dialogue.
So the problem, if we want, the problem or the question, we use those terms sort of interchangeably in here. But the problem then was not necessarily an architectural one. It was a public communication problem. It was if you want, a PR problem. It was like, we are not, the salt company feels like, hey, we're trying to reach out to the community, but we seem to be having no luck. They don't appreciate anything that we're doing. None of it resonates. And that's why they had a need that they could not fill themselves, and they were so desperate that they were willing to actually talk to architecture students.
I think that's a tremendous point. I mean, that was a revelation for me as an architect at that moment, exactly the moment you're talking about. We had been reading a lot of different articles. We had been starting to understand a new movement of architecture, which tried to understand just that, is that architecture is a very finite piece of the constructed environment. And there's in fact many systems that need to be choreographed that in fact dictate how people relate to these spaces. And I think more than anything, I've come to realize that with industries and infrastructure, architecture just as a building is very rarely even a piece of the puzzle. No. But they're very physical things. You use architecture to solve the problem, but it is not a building that solves the problem.
Well, that's a great segue. I think probably most of us were extremely interested to see the first. I'm going to jump to the first thing you showed us,
sure.
The new project, the I-93 understory thing, which is, again, it is not something that if I polled people in this classroom, in this auditorium, they would not necessarily think of that as a typical architecture project. There's a highway, and we're going to try to make the underside of it, or what happens, the dark, shadowy, drip-filled, nasty kind of underside of a highway, which for those, you guys were not here in the late 80s and early 90s when the heroic work to bury the central artery was done. But as you probably know, the Greenway downtown is where there used to be a big, long, raised steel expressway, under which, for a mile and a half, was just this kind of nasty, unsure what to do with it kind of landscape.
Yeah.
And the irony that we built another one
just south
in order to bury the first one is and spent $18 billion doing it is not lost on us. But the opportunity, well, first of all, there's so many questions to ask about the understory thing. And they really, it bleeds into the work that you did in Chelsea and the work that you do in all these places where there are multiple constituents. And it's not clear, for example, one might not imagine, well, who would sponsor the work underneath the expressway, and why is it the Department of Transportation care as long as the highway is working properly? Yeah. What's the engine for the understory work? Is it public? Is it a civic agenda, or is it revenue generation?
Well, it's revenue generation in a very interesting way. I think the irony is, as you kind of point out, is there's a huge amount of development that's all of a sudden happening right there. As the city's growing, as Mayor Menino has put out a new call for 30,000 units of housing. This is immediately adjacent to what was called the Herald site, which is now a big ink block development. So we have about 4,000 new residents expected in the next 5 years living right next to this new raised highway we just built. So they're now setting the stage for the exact same thing that we depressed the central artery for. I think everyone's just looking for a different strategy. So you have all of this residential development coming in, and Boston has actually put a cap on new parking development. So the revenue generator of this project, which I think is quite interesting, is the creation of a whole new they're trying to move all the parking that currently exists in the South End out of the South End, put it under the highway, but then recognize that because of the unique characteristics of all this architecture, parking's a very inefficient use of that space. There's so many columns. Right. And it actually leaves a tremendous number of acres of other land immediately adjacent to parking and the Fort Point Channel, which is a big public resource and big kind of parkway. And so what's beautiful about that equation is that actually the way Mass DOT, the organization sponsoring this, can therefore look at it is they've actually got a perpetual revenue generator in the parking, which can then pay for the creation of a new public landscape. And I think what's most beneficial for us is agencies like the Mass DOT have very little resources that they can generate to the creation of just a park. Right. So for one, having that parking, which parking in Boston makes a tremendous amount of money to be able to pay for that. But on the other hand, because we can actually design this landscape now as a way to, let's say, filter the water coming off of the highway to cleanse it, we can actually build this entire public landscape as a piece of infrastructure that essentially double purposes as a public. So when we talk, we're not actually, I probably shouldn't refer to it as a park. We're going to build a piece of water filtration infrastructure which will be publicly accessible as a new, in fact, I think the other cool aspect I didn't speak to of the project is this has now been deemed as sort of a new gateway into Boston as a place where universities and other large institutions will be able to essentially have people ditch their cars, get into shuttles, get into bikes, get into other modes of transit to actually enter the city in order to keep the traffic out of the city. So it's a new kind of mode of a multimodal terminus.
Well, this is really good, and of the many things that we talk about at this table, some, of course, resonate more and have more content embedded in them, and this is one, because this idea about reinventing the underside of the highway and looking at it in a completely new way is what designers do. Dan has already pointed out correctly that architecture, that we're both trained as architects, is a slice of that, a meaningful slice of that built environment. But it's by no means all of it, not even close. And when you get to the kind of place that Boston is, Boston's different from a lot of American cities. It's not Detroit.
Yeah.
Land is scarce. The available land to build high-value things on to have to do with universities, the hospital infrastructure, all that stuff, they're all right near each other, and the only remaining kind of open bits of land are either, they're rail lines, they're under the highway, they're irregular or very poisoned sites for one reason or another. But the demand to do something with those sites is growing such that they're now going to get developed. In other words, they're not the easy ones, but the easy ones are all gone.
Yeah.
Now you have to develop in the hard ones, and that requires
a layering.
There's always a layering of interests.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting that, the need for, when you unpack this project, the need for parking in the South End, very important. And then the limitations on building new parking. So how do you, so that's a kind of design problem right away.
No, well, it's fascinating because what you're speaking to is that you're not going to build housing under the highway. I shouldn't say that, I'm all about layering, but I would generally tend that would be difficult. But the idea that you can liberate land elsewhere in the city by moving one use that fits perfectly fine under the, it's actually a beautiful place to put parking because you don't have to plow it in the winter. It's protected from, it's almost like a pre-built parking garage. So there's a tremendous amount of efficiency with that. And then that liberates a huge amount of developable area that's currently being consumed for parking. But then find a way that this is now situating giant swaths of parking between two communities. How do you actually design that as a robust infrastructure for the community to pass through? What I always love about these equations, and it's almost like the more ingredients you get mixed into that soup, it's the more potential to actually innovate a new model. And that's where I guess as a designer I just get most excited because you just get, the sort of norms in design you get maybe somewhat bored with. There's so many solutions for, but when you actually see this kind of density, this layering is where you really get the innovation for new demands on the city, and new demands innovate new designs.
Yeah, and Boston is such a great laboratory for this because there's lots of examples of this that have already happened. So you don't have to think about this as an entirely speculative operation. Next time you're down in the Back Bay and you have $10 to spend that you don't know what to spend it on, I'm sure that happens to you all the time, go to the top of the Prudential Center. They have a skywalk gallery. You can look at the whole city from up there. It goes all the way around. But look down on Copley Plaza and Copley Place developments. You will see very, very clearly the footprint of the Mass Turnpike running underneath all these developments. That's because the roof of the turnpike is made of concrete, whereas the streets that are not the roof of the turnpike are made of asphalt. So it's very clearly inscribed on the ground that you see from up there. It's extremely obvious. And for those of you who know the city a little bit, you know the John Hancock, who in here knows the John Hancock building? Yeah? Okay. So there's also, and it's a parallelogram, right? It's a glass parallelogram. There's also a companion John Hancock building parking garage, which is also a parallelogram because one set of sides is parallel to the highway, which it sits over, and the other set of sides is parallel to the streets that it intersects with. So there's two different scales of infrastructure overlapping in one place. It's really cool. It's 100% obvious and true, so that you can like impress your parents and friends if you ever go up to the Peru with a casual offhand comment about the layers of infrastructure that you see below. So don't say you're not learning anything in this class, okay? This is very useful information.
Well, that actually speaks, I mean, one thing I've been very intrigued as we look at this project is some of what you're talking about is how do you discern these kind of hidden structures of the city? And one of the amazing things, I'm always looking at this, and it's funny how I have never found a map which shows this I-93 site without the highway overhead. Like when you go on Google, when you go on any mapping software, if you're trying, and it speaks to why that Bostonography map shows such a divide between, you're talking South Boston and South End, which are two of the biggest development districts currently in Boston, two of the most densely settled residential districts in the city, and yet they're not connected hardly at all, except by two streets, which are very sort of uncomfortable to walk on. And ironically, when you go on the map, even though you have these two neighborhoods, it always is shown from that kind of bird's eye perspective, right? It's always this I-93 swath. There's never an appreciation that there's another city which exists underneath. It very much prioritizes that sort of immediacy of a car coming into Boston, which is, I think, very interesting because, again, to you as a person on a bike, you as a person walking, trying to navigate the city, even driving on the surface roads, that infrastructure is obviously what's valuable to you, not the sort of shuttling in and out of the city, yet that's the kind of map of the city.
It's so true. I mean, architects and planners are obsessed with maps, but more and more people are getting acclimated to using maps because you use mapping software in your daily life all the time, GPS and so forth. It's data embedded, so there's, I think more people are getting used to that idea. But one of the, when you talk about the understory project, the I-93 understory project, and we didn't break it out in incredible detail, but it's going to have parking. Mm-hmm. It's going to have water treatment for water coming from. So those are two very quantifiable, yep, explicit, commercially or legally driven uses. Will there be any? Will this? Especially if the dimensions, I'm trying to think of all the drivers that shape such a project. You alluded to something that not everybody in the audience is going to know about, but parking is one of the most dimensionally specific uses that you could ever have. Much more demanding dimensionally than a hospital or even than housing or a school or anything like that. It's very, very specific. And so if the columns are not in a good location to facilitate the passage of cars and the rational and efficient parking of them, that's a problem. Is there space between an efficient parking grid and then the streets that lie beyond for more pedestrian-oriented uses?
Well, that's what we found was very ironic, and you're speaking to this, is, cars are not that big. They're 20 feet long. Well, you have to plan for an 18-foot parking spot by 9 feet wide, a very specific geometry, as you're saying. The turning radius of the car, you have to plan for a 25-foot lane between the cars. And when you throw in these columns, it's amazing, actually, how much land gets left over. And the biggest amount of land that we're confronting is actually immediately adjacent to Four Point Channel, in that they just, as they laid out their revenue generation, they found they were left with about 2.5 acres of free space that they could not utilize, that was disconnected from the infrastructure. And to them, to people like organizations like the Mass DOT that are literally managing thousands of acres, that is, that's lost in, a slight miscalculation. 2.3 acres is nothing. But on the ground, to someone living in a dense city, 2.3 acres is actually a monumental park. It's quite significant. And in this case, it happens to be immediately adjacent to Four Point Channel, right. Which is, if you're familiar with Boston, it's where we're building a whole harbor walk. It's a whole kind of recreation network. So the irony became that they saw that as essentially almost throwaway, and to the perspective of sort of urban designers or landscape designers, it becomes a great resource. ironically, trying to find a way in as a designer for how we could, more than anything, justify how an organization like the Mass DOT could pay to build a park, which will in fact have amenities like basketball courts, will in fact have amenities like bike trails, walking trails, immediately adjacent to water picnic areas. We're planning fitness trails. These are all things that are part of the community discussion at this point, is that we needed to, in some ways, package that potential in the world of infrastructure so that an organization like the Mass DOT could essentially fund it.
Right,
and for them, they don't really have a difficult time finding the funding to do it. They have a difficult time fitting it within their mission to serve the state. But if we can talk about a park as a way of managing stormwater off of an infrastructure, they can then essentially fund that as an infrastructural improvement.
Now, how about crossings? I don't want to get too architecture and urban design oriented here, but you know, when you talk about a barrier, and when you talk about the Bostonography maps, which, by the way, they exist in more than just in Boston, right? But they're just to be clear, I'm not sure that people necessarily know what they are. They poll citizens all over the city and ask them to define the perimeter of the outline of their neighborhood. What's the edge of your neighborhood? And then they aggregate all this information, and 99% of the darkest zone is the part that everybody agrees is in South Boston or the South End. But then the colors get lighter as there's less agreement about where the boundaries are, so that it's like an X-ray map of people's understanding of the city, and all those white areas
are where people have no understanding.
Well, and they just don't feel it belongs to anybody. And not surprisingly, in a city that is laced with as much infrastructure as Boston, those barriers, rail lines, highways, and the like, have served effectively, not accidentally, as the boundaries of neighborhoods, like defensible outlines of, this is my neighborhood, not your neighborhood. And now that we are now that the city has progressed so much, now that we are trying to penetrate those things, I'm wondering, were there any particular, I know there are some important streets that cross underneath there. Are there efforts being made to make that feel more like a connection?
Ironically, the way this project has evolved is quite interesting. So the development is happening in the south end side of I-93. So you've got 4,000 new residents moving into this area. In fact, the closest subway stop is the Broadway T-stop in South Boston, which is on the other side of I-93. Right. So for anyone moving into this area, one of the greatest sort of selling points coming into this area is their ability to get over to that red line stop and get to, Alewife, to go to the technology centers out there, go to Downtown Crossing, go to Park Street. So ironically, here it is that all this development in the South End is actually what's creating a new magnetic pull to South Boston. So the developers in the South End, recognizing that new, added value to their property, have actually put up a relatively small amount of money. They put in a certain amount of mitigation money, about $250,000, to do studies and development of exactly what you're talking about, crossings. And it was in our kind of investigation of creating what we're now calling the super crossings. We're planning 2 super crossings, which are sort of densified, pedestrian improved crossings through that infrastructure, that we started asking about all this extra land, that we started saying, hey, what's going to happen to all this? Because if you're crossing now, that creates access to these previously lost areas of land, which is then what got us in conversations with Mass DOT into this much larger project. So it's an example where exactly what you're asking, the simple mission to create crossings, became very quickly a new potential in the city, because those crossings currently are quite miserable. And if we improve those crossings, then the question becomes, what happens to all this land immediately adjacent, which then triggered the kind of interest in this whole park development. So you kind of hit the nail on the head on that. Actually, the crossings are the driver of that entire region. And ironically, a small investment in crossings has created the new potential for what is now going to be a significant investment in the whole park landscape.
A larger and interesting conversation that we won't have right now, but is very related, is we had the same discussion around the design of the central artery, about whether it was going to be a series of crossings from the core of the city to the areas that would give you access to the waterfront, like the North End and so forth, or whether it was going to be a linear park, a zone. And those two conceptions are meaningfully different, and yet citizens did not, I don't think designers did as good a job as you are doing at communicating the meaningful difference between those approaches.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? In other words, I think, frankly, this generation of working with infrastructure benefits enormously from the tremendous increase in value that has occurred in the city, so that there are economic engines and not just goodwill
I
to
think,
drive these things.
Back in the 50s and 60s, when there was a far greater amount of people moving out of cities, moving into the suburbs, there wasn't the pressure on these landscapes. In fact, that's where a lot of these development standards came from, is it became actually, there was a lot of kind of wasted land. And it's really now that people are consolidating back into the city that this pressure recreates in these. So no, I think it's tremendous. The other thing we're always sort of laughing at is the sort of recent history of post-industrial redevelopment of these landscapes. Something like the High Line has, in an odd way, changed how people look at the infrastructure. I would say, like pre-High Line, just as a sort of a landmark project, people would look at infrastructure as just sort of this dirty, foreign thing that they didn't want in the city. And what's ironic is now when we're talking about even living, and that's a very, I think, common trajectory, right, is that in urban environments, as soon as an industry or a large-scale infrastructure dies, everyone kind of memorializes it. So like when the fishing industry is kicked out of a town, then everyone remembers the good old fishing days. When the mills are shut down, everyone kind of memorializes the mills. But that has actually started shifting, where now people see, it's funny how often people say to us, like, oh, that's just like the High Line. And it's like, well, except it's still an active salt dock, or it's still it's not dead. Like, it's still a living piece of industry. But actually, through design, people can reconceptualize that isn't just like a nasty, ugly thing. It's actually kind of intriguing.
How many people in here are familiar with the High Line, the new park in New York City? Okay. So for those of you who are not, it is about a 3-mile long
elevated
rail line that was used for industrial purposes only. It was never a passenger line. It was to service second floor
industry production
for 30 blocks in the lower west side of Manhattan. And it was adaptively reinvented 5 years ago, 8 years ago.
Probably 8 at this point.
At this point, yeah.
Time flies.
And it's been an enormous success. It's one of the most popular destination parks in New York. But as you say, it's meaningful. It's a meaningfully different enterprise. This is, a beautifully done, romantic reuse of the grand scale of the skeleton of a rail line. What you're doing, and what's in both of these cases, in all of these cases, is using currently used infrastructure for its intended purpose, and then finding ways to add value on top of that. It's a different enterprise.
Yeah.
I mean, they both have value. The so-called, again, not everybody in here is probably familiar with the so-called rails to trails idea, but for those of you who aren't, there's been a movement in the United States to reuse a lot of old rail lines to create bike cycling networks. And again, that is the irony there is just after we do all this, people are saying, gosh, we don't have enough rail lines. And
to bring in ethanol or to bring in all these new things we want. Well, some of the big drivers are, you're looking at Manhattan. A story I like to often tell with the case in Manhattan was, it was after the Minneapolis bridge collapse, which happened just about 4 years ago. At this point, was a critical bridge in Minneapolis collapsed. And New York City saw that happen and essentially freaked out and went and they did a quick survey of all their bridges, deemed that many of them were insufficient in terms of their maintenance. And they actually lowered the bridge weights in one night of legislation from 105,000 pounds to 80,000 pounds. Now, the problem with that is when you subtract the weight of the truck, what's left is you've literally cut your cargo capacity of trucking in half. But you didn't cut Manhattan's need in half. So now you've just, in one piece of legislation that took about 1 week, you just doubled truck traffic. And the irony was that was such an economic shift. Like we experienced it in the salt because all of a sudden they had to rewrite all their contracts with trucking. I mean, in the case of many of these, almost the entire cost is transportation, right? Like salt is so cheap, it's all transportation. So you've just doubled the salt costs, and Manhattan uses 1 million tons alone of salt at $90 a ton, that's 90 million. So your budget for annual salting of the roads went from 90 to 180 million in one piece of legislation. So very quickly, everyone, I remember that literally the day after I got the call from the company president saying, we need to find barge locations in Manhattan, start barging into Manhattan from Staten Island, which is, the Staten Island ferry, it's a 20-minute barge ride. And very quickly you start looking along the coast. I can find hundreds of barge piers, but I can't find a single one that is active. Like, they're all now condominiums. And so now New York is trying to barge. They want to reopen for trash. Trash used to be taken out of New York by barge because that's very efficient. It's a heavy thing. It takes a lot of trucks. How do you get these? And the irony is, in that single moment, the entire economy changed just because of the new bridge limits. And yet the infrastructure is all there. It's just unusable.
Right. Well, this is great because it's a great segue, I think, into another theme that we've been talking about, but maybe we could talk about it a bit more explicitly. And that is, your work seems always to be about scale. That it's just central to what you do. Initially, it was an intellectual interest, I think, in your collaboration with Margaret Crawford as a student. But the scale of global industry in salt is a kind of interesting and, if I could say, slightly romantic one because it's just so elemental.
Sure.
It's
fundamental.
It's a fundamental thing. It's a fundamental thing. One can imagine a post-oil economy. One cannot imagine a post-salt economy.
Yeah.
I can't.
No, it's pretty vital. Yeah.
But in the giant scale of the Panamax shipping, that again, we haven't talked about it today, but for those of you who don't know, there's a major project that is now complete
soon to be
complete to dramatically expand the capacity of the Panama Canal. And you might think, oh, well, what's the big deal? It's a huge deal. It changes the scale of shipping from really big to extraordinarily big.
It changes everything. I mean, and that's where your point about this intersect between global and local, it's how do you forecast these transitions? When you're talking about something like the post-Panamax phenomenon, right? So a current Panamax vessel, Panamax refers to the largest size ship that can fit through the Panama Canal. I can't remember the exact dimensions, but it's about 760 feet long, 120 feet wide, and you have a 40-foot draft to the ship. So that's a module, right? And that was very sort of instrumental, similar to when we established containers, which is called a TEU. And those, you don't think about it when you're existing in your urban environment, but the second shipping, goods distribution became containerized, it set a global module. That global module dictates Italy, it dictates Boston, it dictates Latin America, it dictates how every size of the road, it dictates the size of the highway, it dictates how far buildings are separated apart in order to turn a truck to get around a building. It sets everything. And in balance with everything else, that sets everything. But what's amazing now, what we're watching with the post-Panamax, it's how do you carry that out as a designer? How do you forecast that? How do you design around post-Panamax? The current Panamax vessel carries 5,000 TEU, 5,000 containers. Post-Panamax, the water depth increases from 40 feet to 50 feet. So that's why you're seeing New York just undertook its largest port development project in the history of New York, going down to 55 feet to allow post-Panamax. Post-Panamax carry 12,000 TEU. So that means the capacity of the ship has more than doubled. That means very quickly ports, cities built around the historic model of Panamax ships will no longer be economically competitive with the post-Panamax ships come 2015, very close to now. Now, you watch a city like New York, something like the Bayonne Bridge, which connects Staten Island to Bayonne, has only an air draft of 150 feet. The post-Panamax can't fit under that, so they're raising that to the tune of it's a $1 billion bridge raising proposal. But then you trace that little move. Now all of a sudden all the entry ramps, exit ramps have to exit into Bayonne, exit into Staten Island. So you're ripping down entire communities simply to elevate that bridge. But then you zoom out one more layer and you say, well, what's going to happen to Boston? Because Boston can't take post-Panamax ships north of the Ted Williams Tunnel. Because when we built the Ted Williams Tunnel, it's only at 45 feet. The majority of our port infrastructure is north of the Ted Williams Tunnel. So what's going to happen to all that? Will we be economically competitive? Or will all of that land now become, post-industrial land 20 years from now? And will we now depend on like short sea shipping or rail connections down to Port Newark, which can receive these ships? So you start looking at the entire global shift, right? You're talking, when we talked before about the value of 2 acres of land in the city, you're now talking about trillions of dollars of economy, which are going to shift potentially from Boston to New York, and the new impetus. So this is why when we go to rails to trails and why the federal government wants to preserve rail lines to New York, it's because if all of a sudden we're not bringing ships to Boston, we're now looking for new connections to Newark. So I'm very interested in a designer in exactly trying to understand those kind of mappings and trajectories, to understand how what seems like a very benign or simple equation happening in one part of the world ripples and transforms, and to understand that this could be in 20 years, we're experiencing that degree of change will have reverberated into Boston.
Well, and when you think about the number of disciplines that overlap with the sort of thing you're talking about, transportation, obviously civil engineering, but also public policy to a major degree, economics, all of these things are woven into this large-scale infrastructural thinking. We're saying nothing about the infrastructure that may well be necessary to deal with rising waters.
Well, and that's where
whether that might possibly mitigate this draft issue.
Well, exactly what you're alluding to is, I think, one of the greatest unrealized potentials right now is where in New York, for example, they've just undertaken the largest reconstruction project of the waterway system of New York. It was like a $5 billion project to just dredge from 40 feet to 55 feet. Consequently, Hurricane Sandy, unfortunately, had happened just after that work was done. And now, somewhat ironically, everyone in New York is trying to evaluate the structure of the shoreline as a way of bracing and dealing with a future surge event. And when you start looking at are there opportunities for this $5 billion investment in bringing the post-Panamax in to be partnered with the creation of new storm containing wetland environments, you start realizing that ironically our typical practice as designers or as planners to separate and isolate industrial development from ecologic development and keep those things separate, when you actually start understanding that those two things interestingly can align and partner, you get much more potential benefit.
I think one of the things that people will notice, one of the things we talked about as sort of the definition, one among the sort of loose definitions of good design, is that it almost always, I would say it always, solves more than one problem at a time. In other words, that's when we look at a great design of anything, whether it's a car or a house or a kitchen or a piece of infrastructure, it's solving more than one problem at a time, which gets back to the sort of basic point about your work in Chelsea, is that it was about solving the needs of both a big industrial use and the needs of a community. Finding something that did both things is what made it a good design. You could have made a perfectly dimensioned, tremendously accessible salt pile.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The perfectly shaped thing to have the boat pull up at just the right point so its boom comes over. It could be entirely driven by that and maximized or optimized to that criterion and that one only.
Yeah.
But what makes it a great design is that it solves more than one problem at a time.
And it's fundamental to even making it possible. I mean, in the case of what you're talking about with the salt facility, we spent years analyzing the actual operations of the industry and looking for exactly those kind of partnerships. Because it's funny, in the end of the day, everyone wants efficiency, right? So if you look at it from the industry's perspective, the faster they get trucks in and out, the better in terms of their ability to manage their yard. So from the city's perspective, the faster the trucks are out of the city, they're not idling. One of our initial observations was just because of the arrangement of the gate system coupled with the scale systems, the routing of trucks. It was taking trucks 25 minutes to get through the terminal, to get in, load, get out. And that means you have 25. So if you imagine after a snow event, you're discharging 1,500 trucks, and they're each taking 25 minutes. You can imagine what that's doing to the traffic on the street. You can't fit that many trucks. It's a huge amount of idling, huge amount of particulate matter, CO2 going into the immediate atmosphere. The city certainly doesn't want that, and the industry doesn't want that either because it congests the whole operation. We've actually cut that time down to about 2.5 minutes. So you're talking about down about 90% simply by rearranging the view corridors for the trucks, rerouting the trucks, looking at simple tricks like putting the truck routing on the waterfront side of the salt, removes the trucks from the streets so the noise. You start all the trucking at 4 a.m. in the morning in order to beat rush hour. Of course, the neighborhood hates that because then that's starting a lot of noise before they wake up. Yet, environmentally, you don't want to be releasing that trucks during rush hour because then you're just adding to that congestion. What was ironic in this whole process, and I alluded to it in the initial slides, was there's different ways of understanding the sustainability, and sustainability is not a scalable concept. What's sustainable to like you or I as individuals may not be sustainable when you magnify that 1,000 times. And now it's serving 1,000 people, right? You or I getting around on a bike might be efficient. Trying to move 50,000 tons of salt by bike becomes very inefficient, right? It is a matter of scale. And what's very funny is when you look at legislation designed around sustainability and making environments more efficient, you often find that discrepancy where one community, like I said, a city or a town, advocates for something that's very oppositional to how the region or the federal government can function efficiently. So as designers, we literally made 2 drawing sets. One that was for conversations with the state and one that was for conversations with the city. To the state, we could actually never refer to what we were making as a park because they could not allow a park into the industrial waterfront. It would be considered too much of a detriment to the industrial waterfront. So there we have to refer to it, for example, as public access in an industrial environment. But to the city, they have no interest in the industry. So we would literally have to make separate drawings to show to each in order to essentially promote the philosophies of either or, in order for either one of them to accept the overall design.
Right. You guys have been, and the students here, most of them would have no way of knowing how unusual it is to work at the scale and across scales as you do, and across disciplines as you do. I mean, there's a growing group of people who do this because we are facing, Boston is not the only place that is facing really clear conflicts between local and regional interests. They happen everywhere because there's let's say there's global agriculture, and then there's local agriculture, and those things in France, in the United States, all over, those things can be in real conflict. But you guys have been really great at crossing those kinds of scales and dealing with those kinds of issues. But I wonder, are there projects like that you would like to tackle that you haven't been able to get access to yet? Or are you so drowning in the amount of work it takes to deal with the ones that you have that you don't have time to think about that?
Well, we are definitely drowning in the projects that we have, largely because, as you say, we're a very small design firm, I think, in a way, competing in a world of actually what are typically very large kind of infrastructural planning, I would even say more like agencies or organizations, and trying to build the kind of networks of consultants and engineers to work with us on these projects, I think certainly helps us sort of tackle them. There are many, I think where I'm kind of most excited now and some of it is just even in the 9 years we've been working on projects, it was like a really uphill battle when we started this work. It was odd how many kind of community meetings or sitting down with politicians, how many people were relatively anti anything related to these types of developments. And it was very difficult to get any traction. I really feel in the last 9 years that has changed. There are things I regret early on in the projects that we couldn't have pushed for more, as in if I could redesign this park in Chelsea, I think there's better water management strategies that could have been incorporated. But at the time, And I think what's actually kind of amazing is that you can actually see, and people are always telling me like, oh, these things take forever. They take so much time. And I'm always amazed. I always want to say like, no, they really don't. These things happen very fast. And I think the thing is a lot of these things happen so fast that we actually, as designers, are not very well positioned to often react to them. And that's where I'm trying, like when these legislations, for example, occur, they ripple so quickly. So for example, I remember during the last economic recession, again in New York, we've been doing a lot of work in New York. I just didn't show as many of those projects, but it was odd, the kind of immediacy of the shift in perception, wherein everything was shifting to parks, condominiums on the waterfront. And as soon as that economic recession, as soon as the economy slowed down, just a slight hiccup, everyone started talking about job creation, preservation of maritime industry. Literally, zoning codes changed. They created special development districts for industry. Right. And all of a sudden, as a designer, our capacity of what used to be fighting the uphill fight of saying we need to preserve these maritime industries became we were just towing the party line of these are for jobs, this is for the sustainability. The other major game changer recently, which is great in some ways, was Hurricane Sandy. In Boston and New York has changed everything about waterfront development. I mean, what used to be, and you're still seeing the kind of, I think, tail end of past development strategies, people developing types of structures on the waterfront that are not so efficient in terms of how they should be built. But that's a landmark shift where we even have a project in New York that's about building a BRT line. I think I've shown maybe some bits to you on that.
Rapid transit.
A bus rapid transit line along the North Shore of Staten Island. And pre-Sandy, we had a whole meeting with the MTA, the New York Mass Transit Authority. We sit with them, and they say, oh, this is a great project. This is definitely how it should be done. We just have no impetus to do it right now, which is essentially to create a whole new bus transit system on the North Shore of Staten Island, and sort of like the Silver Line here in Boston. And it was literally just 4 months after Sandy that all of a sudden you're getting calls from Governor Cuomo's office saying, now we want to re-engage this, and they're now trying to get the funds from the federal government to actually activate this line. And so you're going from something that was sort of off the radar to now something that, and ironically in that case, they're seeing it as Staten Island was really devastated after Hurricane Sandy in their availability of getting resources, and people moving around. The bridges and the tunnels were really kind of decimated, and they couldn't get goods into the island. Right. So their transit infrastructure has become a major issue for them. And so ironically, what you're promoting as a transit issue, you wouldn't sort of foresee that all of a sudden, because our proposal actually elevates the BRT lines into a higher elevation. So the fact that we're just promoting elevating that above the flood line all of a sudden makes that a valuable project in a new context.
Right.
So it's sort of another example where here's one of these global forces, these global factors, and how, as you a designer, sort of tune that global factor into a local sort of reaction.
Well, I think a lot of us feel that real design thinking is necessary at the policy level to deal with all these changing circumstances, whether it's rising water, whether it's the threat of tougher storms, to make sure that what we spend money on, big money on, infrastructure scale money on, solves more than one problem, does more than one thing, because there are a lot of large scale needs, and I think that's where some of what you guys do really comes into play. I'm going to open it up to students here in just a second, but we try to review the kind of 8 words very quickly, and many of them we've already covered. Context is one of them, and the context for your work, the global context, and the local one we've already, I think, addressed. The notion of the question or problem, I think we've already addressed. That we often talk about empathy as being essential, that is understanding your audience, and with all your different constituencies. Yeah. And I don't think people probably noticed very quickly, one of your slides was the 19 different kinds of meetings, let alone the number of meetings that you had with these different constituencies in Chelsea. Obviously, the work goes through many iterations. Obviously, as an architect, you're able to help people visualize ideas so that they can better understand them. We think we talk about that as a key part of design, being able to visualize a whole.
I always emphasize that because a lot of times, in this presentation, this topic comes up that, to solve industry or solve infrastructure is not a matter of architecture. And that may be true in the sense of it's not a matter of making a building. But in this whole process, I became more and more convinced about the role of design and beautiful design. And that's why I say something like the High Line is so important even for us, because that is a fundamentally beautiful piece of design that I think really changed how people perceive that's a piece of dead industry, but even what a piece of live industry can be. And it was odd because we had to go through a very aggravating process on many of these projects where when you're talking with negotiations and you're talking policy level, that's where you have to sort of design through your wording. That's where you have to design through your language, design through legislation and regulations and agreements. But it wasn't until we could actually start putting visuals and create an image of what the potential was that we were able to convince anyone of the project. And it was very frustrating because we were very intentionally being forced to kind of hold back an actual design until many years into it. And as soon as we had an actual design and visuals, the project was fast-tracked.
Well, this segues perfectly into the final point I wanted to talk about. In a lot of the designers and people that we've had as guests in this class, the eighth word that we have is leadership, and the idea of how can design play a role in leading change. Yeah. And I think that you and I don't need to be convinced that it can. That being able to, one of the definitions for design that I have is that designers create a vision of a future that people cannot already see, and then help them reverse engineer a way to get to that future. And it seems to me that's exactly what you're describing with the work across these giant scales. Is if you could just walk up to somebody and say, we need to really improve the way the consequences of global shipping impact our community. They'll go, no thanks. I don't even know what you're talking about. Whereas if you show them a dual use facility that is a win for both constituents, it's a different story.
Yeah, no, I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, I guess it's particular to the types of, somehow the projects we always ended up with they're horrible at first. I mean, you go to these environments and they're often kind of, like you described, the kind of under the highway, the drippy, the nasty. And it's kind of amazing how often the actual tangible problems are fixed. Like dripping, off the highway is a very easy, fix. And once you get rid of those what you actually find is, in many ways, these are the most dynamic, unique, and those things that are considered kind of problematic, if remixed, become just edgy and hip, right?
Right. Okay, I want to open it up to questions from you guys. There we go. Yes, sir. Come on up.
So you're talking about your project under the highway. You were saying that you're going to utilize the space to create parking and then repurpose the other parking areas as living spaces. And then you talked about the post-Panamax, all the land north of the Ted Williams Tunnel would be unusable for the industry that it's allocated for, technically.
Oh, yeah.
So I was wondering if you thought maybe it would be possible to do that same reallocation of space, to have the land north of the Ted Williams Tunnel maybe become residential or something, and then just make everything south of there the industrial where the post-Panamax could fit.
Well, those are the types of broad trajectory visions that are, I think, really complex, because it really starts questioning how the entire system is going to work, right? And I think what you're getting at is the idea that, south of the Ted Williams Tunnel in South Boston, where, for example, containers are coming in currently, that is an area that will be able to facilitate this new scale of industry. And in fact, the Panama Canal is largely being expanded in order to bring containers. That's the main driver for that expansion, is the specific shipping of containers. North of the Ted Williams Tunnel, is where actually all of our home heating oil comes in. It's where all of the natural gas comes in, all of the salt, all of the jet fuel for Logan Airport, it's mainly petroleum north. Now, the question starts becoming, are there tipping points in the industry, right? And it's hard to forecast, or hard to, like I can't make personally that forecast just yet. Do I expect that infrastructure will, in the next 50 years, be undermined by this change? I actually don't. I think it will continue to operate with smaller scale ships. I think we'll be paying more for our petroleum than like it would cost to bring it into Port Newark. But compared to bringing it into Port Newark and transferring that into a rail system, which we honestly don't have to get it up here, in which case, because we've actually undermined that. It's as simple as the fact that constant complaint in Boston is that in contemporary rail transit, you have to double stack cars. You'll see that in the Midwest all the time. You put 2 containers right on top of each other. We don't have the air draft of our overhead road system to allow for double stacked containers to leave downtown South Boston and head inland to rail transfer stations. So it's an unbelievable map to dig into those degrees of detail to understand what's the tipping point. The big thing in Europe right now is the philosophy of short sea shipping, right? Setting up major port hubs like Rotterdam and then essentially unload cargo into smaller scale ships and smaller scale barges to distribute to subports. So some people have thought Boston could essentially become a subport of Port Newark. But that would require, again, one whole extra step of transshipment, which just adds cost. I mean, in the end of the day, it all adds. I mean, in the world of salt, it's an amazing thing to watch the transportation cost, because the material itself produced at the mine in Chile, for example, where a lot of the salt comes from, is about $7 a ton. And then by the time it's distributed on roads, its net cost is about $100 a ton. So by the time,
It's 93% shipping.
Yeah.
And that's just the transfer of, like, to bring a salt ship through the Panama Canal, the toll at the Panama Canal is $250,000, So it's just, that's where the economy is. And then the irony, though, is, for example, New York City is such a dense urban environment. I was talking to some of my students from one of my courses here, talking about this just the other day. New York City, Manhattan is such a dense urban environment, they really can't plow snow, right? So they have what's called a full melt philosophy. They melt everything. So Manhattan alone uses just about the same amount of salt as all of the state of Massachusetts. They get all of their salt from Chile, Egypt, Mexico, right? Yet the largest salt mines in the world are in upstate New York, right? But when you just look at the transportation infrastructure from upstate to New York to Manhattan is a less efficient system than bringing it from Chile. And so that's where you have to start evaluating these systems. And so I can't give you an easy answer because logic is often not like what would seem like it's always logic always wins. You just have to get a dense enough and deep enough understanding of the layers of that logic to sort of ascertain the result.
Well,
right?
and this is an interesting place we have a very international audience. Part of the context here is, of course, the political and legal structures of the different places in this global economy. So if you wonder, how is it that China, for example, has been able to execute such gigantic infrastructural projects over the last 25 years, it is because virtually none of the obstacles that you face in New England imagine the difficulty of creating a brand new railroad right-of-way between New York and Boston.
From the Finger Lakes to
it's
Manhattan.
just inconceivable. The legal hassles of intersecting with so much privately owned land. Most of the railroad right-of-ways were generated in the latter part of the 19th century when it was the legal system was very different about this sort of thing, and the idea that, of course, the government needs to buy some of your privately owned land because we need to grow as a nation. But now, as a mature, wealthy country, we're much less able to do this. And so that's just another kind of environmental issue, it seems to me, is simply how this works. Do we have other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank Dan Annis very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.